The divided stream. The stream, once the very soul of Harmony Creek, now felt less like a vein of life and more like a scar. Its clear waters, usually a symphony of gentle gurgles and the occasional splash of a kingfisher, now carried a faint tremor of discord. For generations, it had flowed unburdened through the Miller property and then past the Amish farmlands, a shared blessing. Children from both sides had waded in its cool depths, skipping stones and chasing minnows, their laughter indistinguishable. But that was before the drought, before the accusation of diverted water, before the shouted words that had fractured the peace like a stone shattering ice. Elder Samuel, his face etched with a lifetime of sun and faith, stood before the assembled community, his voice a low rumble. "The Ordnung is clear," he stated, his gaze sweeping over the rows of bonneted women and straw-hatted men. "The worldly ways pose a threat to our spiritual purity. In light of recent misunderstandings with the Miller family, it has been decided there shall be no further contact, no trading, no shared paths. The stream shall remain our boundary, not our bridge." A collective sigh, hushed and heavy, rippled through the group. Across the valley, Mr. Miller, his jaw tight, addressed his own family with equal severity. "They've made their choice," he declared, thumping a calloused hand on the kitchen table. "If they want to act like strangers, then strangers they'll be. You keep to our side of the fence, you hear? No talking, no trading, not a single word exchanged. You want to buy butter, you go to the store, not their market stand." His eyes, hard and unforgiving, settled on Caleb. "And you, boy, you keep your head down. No trouble." Sarah, her fingers deftly sorting ripe tomatoes into baskets at the community market, felt the weight of the new rules pressed down on her. The vibrant chatter that usually filled the air now felt subdued, the easy camaraderie replaced by a watchful silence. Her eyes, usually quick to meet a friendly glance, now instinctively dropped, scanning the worn wooden planks beneath her feet. The scent of fresh-baked bread and sun-warmed berries, once comforting, now carried a subtle tang of sadness. She moved with quiet efficiency, her movements graceful and practiced, her gentle demeanor a carefully constructed shield against the tension that permeated the air. Today, however, the shield felt thin. She could feel his presence before she saw him. Not a direct gaze, but a subtle shift in the market's rhythm, a sudden hush in the nearby English conversations. Caleb Miller, tall and broad-shouldered, was making his way through the market, ostensibly inspecting the carpentry tools at the far end. His usual stride, confident and purposeful, seemed a little more hesitant today, his gaze carefully averted from the Amish stalls. Sarah kept her head down, arranging jars of apple butter with meticulous precision. Her heart gave an unexpected little flutter, a nervous tremor she quickly tried to quell. It was just Caleb Miller. She'd known him since childhood, though their interactions had always been fleeting, punctuated by the unspoken rules of their separate worlds. Now, those rules were explicitly stated, carved in stone. She heard the shuffle of boots on the wood chips nearby, closer than the usual distance. A shadow fell across her stall. Sarah's breath caught. She didn't look up, focusing intensely on a rogue berry clinging to a basket. "Morning," a low voice murmured, so soft she almost thought she imagined it. Sarah's head snapped up, her eyes wide with alarm. Caleb stood a few feet away, holding a small, intricately carved wooden bird, pretending to examine it. His eyes, the color of rich earth, met hers for a fleeting moment, a spark of surprise, then a quick, almost imperceptible nod. He hadn't directed the greeting at her, not really. It was a general market greeting, easily dismissed as such. But the way his gaze had found hers, the brief connection, spoke volumes. "Morning," she whispered back, her voice barely audible, then immediately regretted it. Elder Samuel's words echoed in her mind. No contact, not a single word. Caleb's lips twitched, a ghost of a smile, quickly suppressed. He turned slightly, shifting his weight, his eyes now scanning the other stalls, a practiced indifference settling over his features. He knew the rules as well as she did. His presence here, even this brief, almost silent exchange, was a trespass. Sarah, feeling the heat rise in her cheeks, retreated further into her task, her hands trembling slightly as she adjusted a linen cloth. The divided stream, it seemed, flowed not just through the valley, but through the heart of Harmony Creek itself. And, she realized with a strange mix of fear and curiosity, perhaps through her own heart too. A spill and a glance. The crisp morning air at the market usually hummed with a predictable rhythm, the clatter of horse-drawn carts, the low murmur of bartering, the occasional joyful cry of a child. But today, a brittle quiet overlay the familiar sounds. Sarah, her bonnet securely tied, moved with an unusual stiffness as she arranged a pyramid of plump crimson apples on her family's stall. Every interaction felt amplified, every glance weighed down by the unspoken rules. She could feel the subtle shifts in the crowd, the way Amish folk now kept a wider berth from the worldly stalls, and vice versa. It was like a new, invisible current ran through the market, pushing them apart. Her mind, usually focused on the tasks at hand, kept drifting to Caleb. The fleeting exchange of words, the shared glance, it had been a spark in the gathering gloom of the community's fractured peace, a forbidden spark. She chastised herself, focusing on the careful placement of the next apple. She reached for the woven basket on the ground beside her, a heavy one filled with the last of the season's harvest, her fingers fumbling slightly. The weight shifted unexpectedly, the straw handle slipping from her grasp. A cascade of red and green orbs tumbled across the worn cobblestones, rolling underfoot, scattering like startled deer. A sharp intake of breath escaped her lips. Bending down quickly, her face warm with embarrassment, she began to gather them, wishing the earth would open and swallow her whole. This was precisely the kind of public mishap she now dreaded, the sort that might draw unwanted attention, specifically from those observing the new boundaries. Then, a shadow fell over her outstretched hand. A hand, strong and quick, reached past hers, already scooping up an apple. Caleb. His presence was sudden, unexpected, yet oddly comforting. He knelt without a word, his movements efficient, his eyes focused on the scattered fruit. Their hands brushed as they both reached for the same rolling wine sap. A jolt, like static electricity, passed between them. It was fleeting, barely there, yet it was enough to make Sarah's breath catch. The contact was electric, a small rebellion against the invisible wall that had been erected between their families. He retrieved the last apple near her boot, his fingers brushing the leather. For a moment he held it, his gaze momentarily lifting from the fruit to her face. In his eyes, she saw a flicker of something she couldn't quite name. Concern, perhaps, or a shared understanding of the precariousness of their interaction. He placed the apple gently into the basket, which she had managed to right. "Thank you," Sarah murmured, her voice barely a whisper, the words feeling thick in her throat. She didn't look directly at him, instead focusing on the now full basket, though her peripheral vision registered his movement. Caleb simply nodded, a slight, almost imperceptible dip of his head. He didn't speak. He couldn't. Not here, not now. The unspoken rules hung heavy in the air between them. He pushed himself to his feet, a quiet grace in his movements, and without another word or glance, he turned and melted back into the stream of market-goers. Sarah watched him go, a tightness in her chest. The brief interaction had been innocent, a simple act of kindness, yet it felt charged with a dangerous significance. She could feel the lingering warmth where their hands had touched, a tiny ember glowing against the cold strictures of their divided community. She straightened, smoothing her apron, her cheeks still flushed. The market hummed on, seemingly oblivious to the small, momentous encounter. But for Sarah, the rhythm had irrevocably altered. The weight of the world felt a little heavier, and the fragile hope within her a little brighter. She knew, with a certainty that both thrilled and terrified her, that this was far from the end of their story. The apples were back in the basket, but the seeds of something new had been sown. The roadside repair. The sun, a fiery orb, dipped low, casting long, skeletal shadows across the unpaved road. Sarah urged the aging mare forward, the buggy's wheels churning through the dust. The late afternoon market had been a meager affair, the usual bustle replaced by a muted tension that clung to the air like the humidity before a storm. The weight of unsold goods and unspoken anxieties pressed down on her. Just as she rounded the bend by Miller's Creek, a sharp thwack echoed, followed by the jarring lurch of the buggy. The mare shied, whinnying softly. Sarah pulled on the reins, her heart sinking. A flat tire. On this lonely stretch of road, with dusk rapidly approaching, it was the last thing she needed. She dismounted, her boots crunching on loose gravel, and surveyed the damage. The front right wheel was utterly deflated, the rim practically kissing the dirt. A sigh escaped her lips, mingling with the chirp of crickets beginning their nightly chorus. It would be a long walk home, leading the mare, and her family would worry. Just then, the familiar rumble of an engine broke the quiet. Her gaze snapped up, a knot forming in her stomach. A beat-up Ford pickup, its paint faded to a dull green, was approaching. Caleb Miller. Her breath hitched. The new rules, etched into the community's consciousness, screamed at her. No contact. Absolutely none. She lowered her eyes, hoping he'd pass by, pretend not to see her predicament. But the truck slowed, its brakes hissing. It pulled to a stop a few yards ahead, kicking up a small cloud of dust. Sarah kept her gaze fixed on the ground, acutely aware of his presence. She could feel his eyes on her, a silent question hanging in the thickening air. He killed the engine, and the sudden quiet was punctuated only by the distant croaking of frogs. Then, the truck door creaked open. Sarah didn't look up, but she heard his footsteps, steady and deliberate, approaching. He stopped beside her, close enough that she could smell the faint scent of engine oil and something else, something clean and earthy. Still, she said nothing, clutching the mare's reins tighter. Without a word, Caleb walked to the back of his truck. She heard the rattle of tools, then the thud of a spare tire hitting the ground. He knelt by her buggy, his movements efficient, practiced. The rhythmic clang of a wrench against metal filled the silence. Sarah watched his hands, strong and capable, working with a quiet intensity. A blush crept up her neck. He was defying the rules for her, risking the ire of both their communities. Minutes stretched into what felt like an eternity. The last vestiges of sunlight painted the western sky in hues of orange and purple, deepening the shadows around them. Finally, the tire was inflated, secured. Caleb stood, wiping his hands on a rag he pulled from his pocket. He met her gaze then, his eyes, the color of warm honey, holding a flicker of concern, of something more. "Thank you," Sarah managed, her voice a reedy whisper. It felt inadequate, a shallow pool against the depth of his unsolicited kindness. She reached into the basket that held her remaining market goods, pulling out a loaf of freshly baked bread, still warm from the oven. "For your trouble." He hesitated, his eyes flicking from the bread to her face, then back to the loaf. A small, almost imperceptible smile touched his lips, a shy curving of his mouth that sent a strange flutter through her chest. He reached out, his fingers brushing hers as he took the bread. The contact was brief, a jolt of warmth that lingered. "Be safe, Sarah," he murmured, his voice a low rumble, softer than she remembered. Before she could respond, he turned, climbing back into his truck. The engine roared to life, and he reversed, then drove off, disappearing around the bend as quickly as he had appeared. Sarah stood by her buggy, the lingering scent of engine oil and the faint warmth of his touch on her fingers, the only evidence that he had been there at all. The bread, the quiet act of defiance, the shared, shy glance, it was all a secret, a fragile thread woven between them, growing stronger with each forbidden encounter. She climbed back into her buggy, her heart a complex tangle of gratitude, fear, and a burgeoning, dangerous hope. The road home seemed less lonely now, yet far more perilous. Quiet crossings. The scent of damp earth and the distant bleating of sheep clung to Sarah as she returned home, the repaired buggy wheel a silent testament to Caleb's swift work. Her heart still fluttered with a blend of fear and a strange, unfamiliar warmth. The loaf of bread, now gone, felt like a small, dangerous secret, a thread connecting her to the world beyond their fences. Days bled into weeks, each one a careful tapestry of chores and quiet contemplation. Yet the memory of Caleb's steady hands, his silent kindness, remained. She found herself scanning the horizon more often, her gaze lingering on the distant fields that bordered their land, a subtle shift in her daily rhythm. One crisp morning, while gathering wildflowers by the creek, Sarah heard the rhythmic thud of an axe. She didn't consciously seek him out, yet her steps veered closer to the edge of the woods that separated her family's property from the miller's. Through a gap in the dense foliage, she saw him. Caleb, shirtless, his back a ripple of muscle under the morning sun, was splitting logs with a practiced ease. His movements were powerful, almost graceful. When he paused to wipe sweat from his brow, his eyes, as if sensing her presence, lifted and met hers across the small divide. A jolt, like static electricity, passed between them. He didn't smile, not exactly, but a fleeting softening touched his features. Sarah felt a blush creep up her neck, a hot wave that had nothing to do with the sun. She quickly lowered her gaze, pretending to scrutinize a particularly vibrant bluebell, her fingers trembling slightly. When she dared to look up again, he was gone, the rhythmic thud of the axe having ceased. The air felt charged, humming with an unspoken understanding. These fleeting encounters began to weave themselves into the fabric of her life. A glimpse of him on his tractor, a wave of his hand, so subtle it could have been meant for anyone, as she walked the lane. A shared moment of quiet observation as they both watched a hawk circle overhead, separated by a sturdy oak fence. Each instance was a tiny defiance, a secret language spoken in glances and gestures, a silent acknowledgement of the growing space between them. Sarah found herself unconsciously adjusting her schedule, milking the cows later, lingering at the well, choosing the longer path to the market that hugged the perimeter of the miller's land. She never explicitly sought him out, but a quiet anticipation hummed beneath the surface of her daily tasks. She'd catch herself wondering if he would be there, if their paths would accidentally cross. The fear of discovery was a constant companion, a cold knot in her stomach, but it was slowly being eclipsed by a burgeoning curiosity, a desire for these brief, forbidden moments. One afternoon, as she was hanging laundry, a gentle breeze rustled the sheets. She heard the distinct whir of a drone from the Miller property. It was a new acquisition, a sleek black contraption that often zipped through the air, observing their fields. As it hovered momentarily near their property line, Sarah glanced up. Caleb was standing in his yard, a small remote control in his hand, looking up at the drone. When his gaze drifted down, it found hers. He offered a small, almost imperceptible nod. Sarah, emboldened by the distance and the perceived privacy, returned it, a shy, tentative curve of her lips. It was the first time she had openly acknowledged him since the buggy incident, and the simple act sent a thrill through her. His lips twitched, a hint of a smile playing at the corners before he turned and walked back towards his barn, the drone a buzzing sentinel above him. That night, lying in her narrow bed, the moonlight painting silver stripes across the floor, Sarah found herself replaying the day's quiet exchange. The small nod, the near smile. It was more than just polite acknowledgement. It felt like a recognition, a deepening of the unspoken understanding that had begun on the dusty road. She knew, with a certainty that both thrilled and terrified her, that these quiet crossings were no longer accidental. A dangerous thread, delicate but strong, was being spun between them, drawing them closer with each passing day. The community rules, once an unyielding wall, now felt like a fragile barrier, easily breached by a shared glance, a silent understanding. And with each breach, the world outside her fences, and the man who inhabited it, became a little less forbidden and a lot more compelling. Under the old oak. The day's last light, typically a scorching presence, now offered a tender caress as it sank below the western rim. Sarah, having dispatched her chores with uncharacteristic speed, found herself drawn toward the murmur of willows bordering the stream, a forgotten path these past weeks. The air, still arid, held a subtle, earthy trace from the dampness near the water's edge. An insistent flutter in her chest propelled her onward, each stride lighter than the last. She sensed, rather than knew, this was where she might find him. And there he was, a lone figure silhouetted against the stream's shimmering surface, idly skipping stones. The ancient oak, its boughs like outstretched, wizened limbs, stood sentinel beside him. At the faint whisper of her dress, Caleb turned, his motion unhurried, devoid of surprise. He simply regarded her, a silent query in his gaze. I was just walking," Sarah demurred, the fib feeling brittle on her tongue. Her eyes drifted to the water, then back to his face, a flush warming her neck. A faint smile touched Caleb's lips, a silent current of understanding passing between them. "So was I." He gestured to a fallen log nestled by the tree. "Might as well sit. It's a long walk back." She paused only a moment before settling on the rough wood, her dress fabric grazing the bark. The air thrummed with unspoken sentiments, a delicious yet unnerving tension. "The drought, it's been hard on everyone," she ventured, grasping for a neutral topic. "Yeah, our wells are dwindling," Caleb agreed, his voice a low resonance. He picked up a smooth, flat stone, turning it over in his fingers. "Pa's considering a new one, but it's a huge undertaking." "Our crops, they're struggling," Sarah said, visualizing the parched furrows in their fields. "Ma'am frets constantly." A comfortable quiet descended, punctuated by the cricket's chorus and the stream's soft gurgle. It was a different stillness than she knew in her community, born of mutual empathy rather than stilted decorum. "It must be difficult with the strictures," Caleb murmured, breaking the hush. He didn't look at her, but his tone was gentle, empathetic. "Not being able to speak freely." Sarah swallowed, a sudden tightness in her throat. "It is. Sometimes it feels like a barricade between us and everyone else." She gazed at her tightly clasped hands. "It wasn't always this way. Before the fire," Caleb finished, a note of regret in his voice. "My pa, he never intended for any of this." "I know," Sarah said, meaning it deeply. She truly believed him. "Sometimes. I wonder why things must be so rigid. Why we can't just talk." Caleb finally met her eyes, their hue reflecting the deep green of the overhead leaves. "I wonder that too." A small, almost imperceptible shrug. "I spend a lot of time in the garage, tinkering. Pa says it's a waste, but I like deciphering how things work, how to make them run better." A spark of passion ignited in his gaze. Sarah found herself captivated. "Engines? Like in the buggy?" He chuckled softly. "Bigger. Tractors. Old cars. Someday I want to build one from scratch, a really fast one." "That sounds thrilling," she confessed, a shiver running through her. "I've only seen them from afar." "Maybe someday," Caleb said, his eyes holding a hint of possibility that stole her breath. He tossed the stone into the stream, sending concentric ripples outward. "What about you? What do you dream of?" The question startled her. Dreams were not something she was encouraged to voice, least of all to a worldly boy. But here, beneath the ancient oak, as the setting sun painted the sky in oranges and purples, it felt safe. I've always wanted to see the ocean," she confessed, the words tumbling out before she could retrieve them. "Read about it in an old book once. Its immensity, the way the waves crash." Caleb's expression softened. "The ocean, huh? It's even vaster than you can imagine. And the sound, it's incomparable." He paused, a distant look in his eyes. "Maybe someday you will." The simple sincerity in his voice resonated deep within her. It wasn't a promise, but a shared hope, a quiet understanding that transcended their separate worlds. The air grew cooler as dusk deepened, shadows stretching long around them. "I should go," Sarah said, the words heavy with reluctance. "They'll be wondering." Caleb nodded, rising with easy grace. "Me too." He made no move to detain her, nor did he try to prolong the moment beyond what felt right. He simply stood, watching her, a lingering warmth in his gaze. As she walked away, the setting sun cast long shadows ahead. The path back felt transformed, no longer merely a route home, but a memory, a bridge between two worlds. Her heart still fluttered, but now with a sense of wonder, not just apprehension. She had conversed, truly conversed, with Caleb Miller, and it felt like the genesis of something she couldn't, and didn't wish to, impede. Whispers and worries. The oppressive heat of the afternoon had finally begun to yield, a faint breeze rustling through the cornfields as Sarah finished hanging the last of the wash. Her gaze drifted instinctively towards the winding path that led to the stream, a familiar pull guiding her steps. It had become a silent ritual, this pilgrimage to the old oak, a place where the world of strictures and silent judgments faded, replaced by the hushed cadence of rustling leaves and Caleb's soft voice. He was already there, whittling a small bird from a piece of driftwood, his brow furrowed in concentration. The sight of him, unburdened by the expectations that weighed on her, sent a familiar tremor through her. "Caleb," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the chirping crickets. He looked up, a smile blooming across his face, instantly dispelling the quiet intensity of his task. "Sarah, I was hoping you'd come." He gestured to the mossy bank beside him. "The heat's been something else, hasn't it?" Their conversations, initially tentative and guarded, had deepened with each passing day. Today, as the last sliver of sun painted the horizon in hues of orange and violet, their words flowed with an ease that belied the danger of their meeting. They spoke of the drought, of course, the ever-present shadow over their lives. But they also spoke of dreams, hushed confessions shared under the protective canopy of the old oak. "Sometimes," Sarah admitted, tracing patterns in the damp earth with a twig, "I wonder what it's like beyond the fields, what lies past the county line." She glanced at him, her heart thrumming. "Do you ever think that?" Caleb paused his whittling, his gaze fixed on the distant tree line. "All the time. My uncle, he used to tell me stories about places where the mountains touched the sky, where the ocean stretched further than you could see. Said the air smelled different there, cleaner somehow." He turned to her, his eyes holding a depth she hadn't noticed before. "You'd like it, Sarah. You have a spirit that yearns for more than just these familiar fields." Her cheeks flushed at his words, a warmth spreading through her chest that had nothing to do with the fading heat. He saw her, truly saw her, in a way no one else did. It was a terrifying, exhilarating realization. "And you, Caleb? What about you?" He shrugged, a hint of melancholy in his smile. "I suppose I'm just a farmer at heart, but even a farmer can dream of a better harvest, can't he? A life where things aren't so hard." His eyes met hers, and in that shared glance, a silent understanding passed between them, a shared longing for something beyond their grasp. The air grew cooler, and a shiver ran down Sarah's spine, not from the chill, but from a sudden, stark awareness of their precarious situation. "Caleb," she began, her voice barely a whisper, What if someone found out?" He stopped whittling entirely, the small wooden bird resting motionless in his palm. The lightness in his expression vanished, replaced by a grim set to his jaw. "They won't," he said, but the conviction in his voice wavered. "We're careful." "But if they did," she pressed, the fear tightening its grip around her heart, "what would happen? To you, to me?" Caleb's gaze dropped to the ground, and for the first time she saw a flicker of genuine fear in his eyes. "For me," he said slowly, "it would be trouble. My family, they'd be disappointed, angry maybe." He looked up, his expression hardening. "But for you, Sarah, it would be worse, much worse. They'd say you corrupted me, that you led me astray. You know how they are with the rules, especially with the separation." A cold dread seeped into her. She did know. The shame, the ostracization, the absolute ruin of her reputation within the community. It was a fate worse than any physical punishment. The thought alone was enough to make her stomach churn. Yet even in the face of such terrifying consequences, the thought of never seeing Caleb again, of severing this fragile, beautiful connection, felt unbearable. "We have to be careful," she repeated, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. "So careful." He reached out, his hand hovering inches from hers, a silent testament to the unspoken boundaries that still existed between them. "I know," he said, his voice low and earnest. "I wouldn't do anything to hurt you, Sarah. You know that, don't you?" She nodded, a lump forming in her throat. The sun had dipped below the horizon, casting long, eerie shadows across the landscape. The cricket's song, once comforting, now seemed to underscore the lurking danger. "I should go," she said, pulling back, the warmth of his presence already fading. He stood, his gaze lingering on her face. "Tomorrow?" he asked, a silent plea in his eyes. Sarah hesitated, the fear warring with the desperate yearning in her heart. "If I can," she whispered, turning to leave, the whispers of worry chasing her through the deepening twilight. She didn't look back, but she could feel his gaze on her until she was out of sight, a silent promise hanging heavy in the air between them. Jacob's secret. The late afternoon sun, a bruised purple and orange against the horizon, cast long, distorted shadows across the parched cornfields. Jacob, his straw hat askew, chased a particularly plump grasshopper through the stubble, his laughter echoing in the quiet air. He'd wandered further than usual, drawn by the shimmering heat haze that danced above the distant tree line. That's when he saw them. Two figures, tucked away near the old oak, where the miller's land met their own. He squinted, recognizing his sister's plain bonnet and the familiar dark shirt of Caleb Miller. They weren't working. They were standing close, their heads bent together, a low murmur of voices carried on the breeze. Jacob stopped, the grasshopper forgotten in his cupped hands. He'd been told many times about the boundary, about not going near the worldly folk, and Sarah, she knew it too. Yet there she was, talking to him, not shouting, not warning him off, but quiet, almost secret. Caleb's hand lifted, a quick, fleeting brush against Sarah's arm. Then, as if a bell had rung, he turned, giving one last glance at Sarah before disappearing into the deepening shadows of his own property. Sarah stood for a moment longer, her shoulders hunched, before slowly turning towards home. Jacob, feeling a strange prickle of unease, ducked behind a gnarled apple tree, waiting until Sarah was well ahead before continuing his own path. The grasshopper, forgotten, chirped its escape and vanished into the dry earth. Later, as the aroma of baking bread filled the kitchen, Jacob sat at the rough-hewn table, tracing patterns in a spill of flour. His mother, her face flushed from the heat of the oven, hummed a hymn. Sarah was out in the barn, milking the cows. "Mama?" Jacob's voice was small. "Yes, bub?" She turned, a gentle smile on her lips. "I saw Sarah today." His mother nodded, wiping her hands on her apron. "She was helping Papa with the fence mending." "No," Jacob shook his head. "Not there. By the big oak. She was talking to Caleb." The humming stopped. The air in the kitchen seemed to thicken, suddenly still. His mother's smile faltered, her brow furrowing. "Caleb Miller?" Her voice was soft, but the question held a sharpness Jacob hadn't heard before. "Yes, they were talking for a long time, and he touched her arm." Jacob's eyes were wide, relaying the facts as he remembered them, innocent of the weight his words carried. His mother's gaze drifted past him, out the window, where the last vestiges of twilight painted the sky. A flicker of something, worry, anger, crossed her features. She said nothing more, but the warmth seemed to drain from the room. When Sarah came in, her pail clanking softly, the kitchen was quiet, save for the crackling of the fire. She looked tired, a faint smudge of dirt on her cheek. Her mother's eyes met hers, and Sarah's posture seemed to stiffen almost imperceptibly. The silent exchange hung in the air, heavy and unspoken. It wasn't until after supper, when Jacob was already tucked in bed, that Sarah's parents called her into the sitting room. The lamp cast a dim, wavering light, making the familiar space feel unfamiliar, almost stern. Her father sat in his usual chair, his hands clasped, his expression unreadable. Her mother stood by the window, her back to Sarah. "Sarah," her father began, his voice low and steady. "Jacob told us he saw you today." Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She knew instantly what he meant. The blood drained from her face, leaving her cold. I was just walking near the fields, Papa." Her mother turned, her eyes, usually so kind, now held a deep sadness. "He said you were talking to Caleb Miller by the oak. He said Caleb touched you." The shame burned through Sarah, hot and swift. "It was nothing, Mama. He helped me with something, a loose fence post." The lie felt brittle on her tongue, even to her own ears. "Sarah," her father's voice tightened, a note of warning entering it. "You know the rules. We have spoken of this. The separation is for our protection, for your protection. There can be no fraternizing with the worldly folk, not after what happened." Sarah looked down at her hands, twisting them together. The image of Caleb's gentle touch, the shared dreams by the oak, suddenly felt like a dangerous secret, threatening to unravel her entire world. "Do you understand the gravity of this, child?" Her mother's voice was laced with pain. "The shame it would bring upon our family, upon you. You are a young woman now. You must be mindful of your conduct, of appearances." Sarah nodded, unable to speak, her throat tight with unshed tears. The memory of Caleb's kindness, his concern for her, was now overshadowed by the heavy weight of her parents' disappointment and the unspoken threat of discovery. The peace she had found in those stolen moments felt utterly shattered. The first crack in her secret had appeared, and the world outside, with its harsh rules and unforgiving judgment, was already beginning to seep in. Father's warnings. The day's oppressive heat seemed to bake the very air, a physical manifestation of the tension gripping the Miller household. Mr. Miller stood at the kitchen's epicenter, his voice a low thrum that vibrated up through the floorboards. Caleb, hunched at the scarred pine table, idly traced its grain, his gaze fixed on the phantom impression of Sarah's hand, so recently present. Whispers, delicate as smoke yet spreading like wildfire, had reached his father. "They say you were seen near their place, Caleb," Mr. Miller began, a stark absence of his usual boisterousness in his tone. "Close to the fence line, talking to one of their girls. Is this accurate?" Caleb's throat felt parched. He swallowed, the sound disproportionately loud in the sudden hush. I was by the creek, Pa. I saw her. We just spoke." His father's jaw tightened. "Just spoke? You comprehend the directives, son. You know the history. Your grandfather carried that dishonor to his grave. We don't infringe upon their space, and they don't infringe upon ours. Not since their elders' pronouncements, not since the boundary dispute." He gestured vaguely toward the window, as if the contentious border still shimmered in the afternoon's glare. "Family repute, Caleb. It's not merely about us. It's about our name, our principles. Do you imagine I'd permit our name to be sullied for some trifling conversation at a fence?" Caleb winced at the acerbity in his father's voice. The ancient feud, a narrative recounted in hushed tones around their supper table, encompassed accusations of broken vows, and a tract of land that had fueled decades of animosity. His grandfather, a man of staunch pride, had felt profoundly betrayed, a bitterness that had permeated the very foundation of their kinship with the Amish. "I understand, Pa," Caleb mumbled, though his heart hammered a frantic rhythm against his ribs, stubbornly refusing to comprehend. "No, I don't believe you do," Mr. Miller countered, closing the distance between them. "Because if you truly did, you wouldn't have been observed. You wouldn't have supplied them with fodder for gossip. This drought already has everyone on tenterhooks. We don't require additional strife. Henceforth, you steer clear. You don't approach their land. You don't engage them in conversation. You don't even glance their way. Is that unambiguously clear?" Caleb nodded, a leaden weight settling deep in his gut. The prospect of no longer seeing Sarah, not even a fleeting glimpse, felt like a vital part of him had been severed. Across the parched fields, a different kind of burden was accumulating. Sarah's parents, their visages etched with disappointment and apprehension, had instituted new strictures. Her chores, once a welcome interlude, now felt like a gilded cage. Each task was executed under her mother's vigilant gaze, every movement subject to scrutiny. The air in their modest dwelling hummed with unspoken reproaches, a persistent reminder of her transgression. Jacob, usually her devoted shadow, now averted her gaze, a silent accusation in his wide, innocent eyes. The following Sunday, the community assembled for meeting, the air redolent with hay and dust. Sarah sat beside her mother, the rough weave of her dress abrading her skin. She felt the weight of every eye in the room, imagined every whispered thought. Elder Samuel, his voice a steady balm, began to speak, his words ostensibly concerning the travails of the drought and the paramount importance of faith. But as he spoke, his gaze drifted, a fleeting flicker, in her direction. "In periods of scarcity and adversity," Elder Samuel intoned, his hands clasped before him, "it is effortless for our spirits to stray, effortless for us to neglect the path delineated for us by the Lord and by our progenitors. The allurements of the world are manifold, and they gleam brightest when our own fields lie barren. But we must recall our foundations, our covenants. We must remember our identity and our principles, for a single errant seed can corrupt an entire yield." His words, calm and measured, felt like a brand scorching Sarah's spirit. She knew he wasn't addressing her directly, not overtly, but the message resonated with unmistakable clarity, delivered with the subtle authority of years of wisdom and unwavering conviction. The community, he implied, was akin to a field, and her actions were a stray seed jeopardizing its purity. The shame that had been a dull throb now sharpened into an exquisite agony. She kept her eyes fixed on the worn floorboards, wishing the earth would swallow her whole. The world was constricting, squeezing the breath from her lungs, and Caleb, her sole solace, was now an unreachable phantom. The storm and the stream. The ancient oak, usually a sentinel of solace, felt heavy with the weight of their unspoken goodbyes. Sarah arrived first, her heart a leaden stone in her chest. The air was thick and still, a premonition of something more than just their parting. When Caleb emerged from the dappled shadows, his usually bright eyes were clouded with a mirroring sorrow. He looked thinner, his shoulders slumped beneath a worn denim shirt. I had to see you," he said, his voice raspy. "Just one last time." Sarah could only nod, a lump in her throat preventing speech. The silent judgment from her family, the cold looks in meeting, Elder Samuel's thinly veiled warnings. They had built an insurmountable wall between them. The delicate tendrils of their connection, nurtured in stolen moments, felt brutally severed. She traced the rough bark of the oak, imagining their names etched there, a forbidden testament. "It's for the best," she finally managed, the words tasting like ash. We can't risk it anymore." Caleb stepped closer, his gaze searching hers, desperate. "Is that what you truly believe, Sarah?" A sudden, violent gust of wind tore through the clearing, rattling the dry leaves in the branches above them. The sky, which moments ago had been a hazy blue, now churned with an ominous, bruised purple. Thunder rumbled in the distance, a low growl that vibrated through the earth. A fat raindrop splattered on Sarah's cheek, followed by another, then a deluge. "We should go," Sarah said, turning towards the path that led to her family's farm. But Caleb's hand caught her arm, his grip surprisingly firm. "Wait," he urged, pointing towards the stream that snaked through the valley, separating their lands. The usually docile ribbon of water was already swelling, its banks beginning to fray as the rain intensified. The distant rumble had transformed into a continuous roar, and the wind whipped around them with furious intent, bending the young saplings. The stream, a harmless boundary in dry times, was rapidly transforming into a raging torrent. Branches, debris, and clots of mud churned in its angry current. Sarah's gaze instinctively went to the lower fields of her family's farm, where the young corn sprouts would be submerged if the water continued to rise. Caleb, meanwhile, was already scanning his own property, his eyes wide with alarm. The storm was no longer a distant threat. It was upon them, relentless and furious. "The old culvert!" Caleb shouted over the howl of the wind, pointing to a weak point near a cluster of willows where the stream historically overflowed. "It won't hold!" Without another word, he sprinted towards the bank. Sarah, her own fear momentarily eclipsed by an urgent instinct to protect, followed. The rain was a solid sheet, plastering her hair to her face, soaking her plain dress. The ground beneath their feet was turning to slippery mud. "We need rocks!" Caleb yelled, already straining to move a fallen log. Sarah didn't hesitate. She began wrestling with loose stones, her small hands raw against the jagged edges. Together, they heaved a waterlogged branch into position, then another, creating a crude barrier. The water clawed at their makeshift dam, a hungry beast trying to devour their efforts. Adrenaline surged through Sarah, dulling the chill of the rain and the sting of her protesting muscles. Caleb, his face streaked with mud and rain, worked with a focused intensity she hadn't seen before. Their movements were in sync, a silent, desperate dance against the encroaching disaster. A large boulder, dislodged by the torrent, threatened to breach their fragile construction. "Push!" Caleb grunted, straining against it. Sarah, using all her strength, shoved against the stone, her shoulder aching with the effort. Slowly, agonizingly, it shifted into place, shoring up a weak spot. For a moment, their hands brushed, a fleeting contact that sparked with a different kind of intensity than their previous secret touches, one born of shared purpose and raw survival. The water continued its relentless assault, but their dam, though crude, was holding. The immediate danger to both their fields seemed to recede, if only slightly. Exhausted, panting, they stood side by side, watching the churning water, a strange alliance forged in the heart of the storm. The wind still howled, and the rain still lashed down, but the immediate crisis had been averted. Their goodbyes, so carefully planned, had been swept away by the storm, replaced by a desperate, shared struggle. A new understanding. The roar of the stream, usually a gentle murmur, now thundered, a primal sound of nature unleashed. Its angry voice pulled the families one by one from their homes. Mr. Miller, torch held high, was the first from his side, his shouts of, "Caleb, where are you?" swallowed by the deluge. He found Caleb not in their barn, nor huddled inside, but knee-deep in the churning water, straining with a sodden log. And beside him, her bonnet askew, mud streaking her face, was Sarah. Her dress, typically pristine, clung to her, heavy with water and earth. She wrestled with a section of splintered fence, her small frame braced against the current, her eyes fixed on Caleb's back. They moved with an almost practiced synchronization, a silent ballet of survival. The logs, rocks, and debris they hauled into place were forming a crude but effective barrier, diverting the worst of the stream's fury away from the vulnerable fields. Mr. Miller's initial shock morphed into a complex expression, a cocktail of fury and a grudging awe. He watched as his son, normally reserved, roared instructions over the storm's din, his muscles straining, his face set with a fierce determination Mr. Miller hadn't seen since Caleb was a boy. And Sarah, the quiet Amish girl, was not just assisting, but actively contributing, her hands raw, her breath coming in ragged gasps. From the other side, Amish elder Samuel arrived, his lantern casting long, dancing shadows. Behind him, Sarah's brother Jacob, his young face pale with fear, clutched at his father's sleeve. They too froze, witnessing the impossible. Sarah and Caleb, the two forbidden figures, linked by the shared exigency, by the very danger that threatened to consume them. The shouts of "Sarah!" from her family died on their lips, replaced by the guttural gasp of the wind and the relentless pounding of the rain. For a long moment, time seemed to stretch, taut and fragile, like the makeshift dam itself. The families, divided by generations of custom and recent animosity, stood on opposing banks, their private feuds momentarily dwarfed by the common enemy. The biting wind whipped their clothes, the rain lashed their faces, but their eyes remained fixed on the two figures in the churning stream. They saw not a miller and an esh, but two young people, valiant and exhausted, fighting for their homes, their very existence. Jacob, who had previously avoided Sarah's gaze, now watched her with a strange intensity. The silent accusation in his eyes had been replaced by a flicker of something akin to admiration, then fear. Fear for her safety, perhaps, but also a dawning recognition of her strength. Elder Samuel, his face usually unreadable, showed a subtle softening around his eyes. He had witnessed many storms, many trials, but never had he seen such an unlikely alliance forged in the crucible of chaos. As the first tendrils of dawn painted the sky in muted grays and purples, the storm began to abate. The rain lessened to a steady drizzle, and the stream, though still swollen, no longer raged with the same furious intensity. The makeshift dam, battered but holding, had done its job. The floodwaters, diverted, began to recede, leaving behind a landscape of mud and debris, but also a palpable sense of relief. Caleb, his face streaked with dirt and exhaustion, glanced at Sarah. Their eyes met, a silent communication passing between them. It was a look that transcended words, a shared understanding forged in the crucible of shared danger. Then, as if a spell had been broken, he turned and waded towards his family, his head bowed, his shoulders slumped. Mr. Miller reached out, not to scold, but to steady his son, a rare, almost tender gesture. Sarah, her own strength failing, stumbled towards her side of the bank. Jacob was there first, extending a hand, his touch tentative. She grasped it, a silent acceptance passing between them. Elder Samuel approached her, his gaze sweeping over her mud-caked form. He said nothing, but his silence was not one of condemnation, but of quiet contemplation. The sun, hesitant at first, finally broke through the clouds, casting a golden light over the ravaged landscape. The immediate danger had passed, leaving in its wake a changed world, and perhaps a changed understanding. The unspoken rules hadn't vanished, the boundaries hadn't dissolved, but something new had taken root. A seed of shared humanity, watered by the storm, had begun to sprout. The tension, though still present, was quieter, laced with a new, grudging respect. The memory of Sarah and Caleb, side by side, fighting the flood, would not soon fade. It was a memory that would linger, a silent testament to courage, and to a bond that defied the rigid lines drawn between their worlds.